will be talking about the project that we did in Makhuduthamaga Municipality, which is a local municipality in the Limpopo province in South Africa. So as I said, RIAHSAH Co work on a research project in Makhuduthamaga Local Municipality in Limpopo. The main objective of the project was to conduct a feasibility study and develop a business plan that will guide the municipality in directing the transition of the current subsistence farming practices into commercial farming. And this is also that they could establish agriculture as one of the major economic drivers in the municipality. As I said, Makhuduthamaga Local Municipality is situated in Sekhukhune District Municipality in the Limpopo province in South Africa. The municipality has an agricultural economy mostly dominated by large-scale commercial farming with a poor smallholder-based production system in the deep rural areas. The majority of disadvantaged farmers within the municipality are not part of the mainstream agriculture. That's a main issue, and that's why the municipality is putting so much effort to try and leverage that. They so far been practicing smallholder farming, which is characterized by low production, poor access to land, poor access to inputs and credit, so on and so forth. So if we have to think of the policy framework, agricultural activities identified by the policy framework as key sector in achieving the local economic development. A common aspect in these policies is the targets that they set for increasing agricultural productivity and rural development. The Agricultural Policy Action Plan as a policy framework itself, if you have to think in the context of smallholder farming, it provides guidance for the development of the agricultural sector by promoting sustainable and inclusive growth, while also it articulates measures to support smallholder farmers in the country. That policy includes measures such as increasing access to credits and financing, improving rural infrastructure, and providing technical support and training to small-scale farmers. And there's also the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, which promotes smallholder farming. It requires government entities to prioritize the procurement of goods and services from small, medium, and micro enterprises. Also, businesses owned by historically disadvantaged individuals or farmers. So as you can see from what I said, I didn't talk about all of it, but to pick those few, you can see that good policies do exist. However, the implementation of these policies is still a challenge because there is, in some cases, lack or inadequate funding. For example, even though the Agricultural Policy Action Plan, which I mentioned in the previous slides, include measures for increasing access to credit and financing, the funding for this is still limited. There's also some critiques around trade policies, which people feel that they don't do enough to address structural barriers that smallholder farmers are facing currently. And this will include like limited access to markets, lack of access to resources, and insufficient support for agro-processing and value addition. So maybe to talk about why we did the system map for smallholder farming in Makhuduthamaga. As you know, I said that we were supposed to do feasibility studies and develop a business plan, but we thought that getting a full picture of the system was quite important, and that's why we decided to do the systems map. And it really helped us understand the dynamics of the system, including interactions between the social, technological, or technical, economic, environmental, and political factors that affect the growth of smallholder farmers in the precinct. And you will see as I present the map, you'll be able to see those factors as they play. We also thought that doing a system map would present a neutral view of a system that incorporates multiple perspectives from active stakeholders in the smallholder farming system and explicitly present the relationships forces and feedback loops among the elements in the system. It also helps reveal potential leverage points for intervention to facilitate the transition from smallholder farming practices to commercial farming. The methodology that we use focus on participatory method, which enable us better understanding of the context and allow inclusion of different voices. The primary phase of the process was devoted to collecting and processing quantitative data and materials available from secondary sources. And this was coupled with a secondary phase of qualitative data collection. The qualitative aspect of the research comprised of mixed methods, such as interviews with different experts, sector departments, government sector departments, such as the agricultural department, rural development department. We also did review of the literature. We conducted focus group discussions, workshops, and ethnographic studies. The empirical investigation was informed by key stakeholders and personnel involved in the project, including the beneficiaries themselves, through the steering committees and farmers representatives. And to ensure that the business plan incorporates systemic interventions, we conducted a series of workshops which incorporated various systems thinking tools and canvases with key stakeholders, including farmers and members from sector departments. The workshop were useful in understanding the deep structures. You'll see as I speak to the map, understand the dynamics and overall functioning of the smallholder farming in the area, identifying the gaps in capacity and skills to inform the intervention, collecting insights that could help in building a value agricultural model with an ecosystem of hectares aimed at tackling systemic level issues. So now I'll present the map. This is again to say that this is kind of high level map. I will start with the deep structure, but before I go there, as I said, you will see the regions that I was referring to, right? So you see these are the lighter orange represent the political factors. The darker green here represent environmental factors. Here we've got economic factors, and here you've got technological or technical aspect. You won't be able to read everything, I'm sorry, unless I zoom it. I just want to give you a full picture. At the bottom here, we have got in purple, here we have social factors. But I'll start by talking about the deep structures before I go down to pick up a few variables in different regions. Here, so I'm gonna start from here, policies and regulations. And I'm gonna link it to the issue of land ownership, right? So land ownership is determined by government policies, and it's a significant issue in South Africa. To address this issue, the government has implemented several policies, as I said, and programs such as land redistributions, land restitution, land tenure reform, including agricultural support programs, and you can really name it. But besides that, access to land by landless farmers is still an issue. And without access to land, farmers do not have an interest in farming or even gain the necessary skills that they need to be able to practice. And it also becomes difficult for farmers who do not have access to land to access funding. You see here, funding becomes an issue, or even credit for agricultural activities. And without funding, as you know, it's also difficult for farmers to access input and push for access to infrastructures needed to develop or to do the activities. And production models, as we know, are determined by the type of infrastructures and inputs that are available. And all of this contribute to poor access to market for farmers, which then leads to the need for revisions of policies and regulation to support the transition of smallholder farming to commercial farming. So that's to talk about the deep structure, right? So now I'm gonna pick a few things from the regions. I'll start with the political factors. Again, forgive me, you might not be able to see everything, but I'm just gonna give you an idea. Okay. So I'm looking at the inadequate policy and regulatory environment. This issue makes it difficult for smallholder farmers to access funding and market, as I said, talking from the deep structures. Now I'm trying to expand a bit. And with this, it becomes very difficult again to increase their productivity or their production. And as I was speaking about policies, for example, if you think of the Comprehensive Agricultural Support Program, CAPS, it's a provision for agricultural development in South Africa, and its role is to provide funding and technical assistance to smallholder farmers and agricultural schemes that exist there. And as we were doing the project, we find out that the implementation of its implementation efforts in the past has focused more on mainly infrastructure provision and leaving the funding aspect out. And that has been really challenging if you have to think about it. And if I have to zoom here at the map, you will see that this issue of policy is also, if you're able to see this, it also limits the bargaining power of smallholder farmers. It becomes difficult for them to really negotiate market. And since I spoke about bargaining power, I think I'm just going to zoom a bit there and unpack it a little bit. Yeah, I hope you can be able to see. If you don't read everything, forgive me. So what we also find out was, and I'm talking about bargaining power here, we found out that there is high competition in the market, which makes it difficult for smallholder farmers to negotiate better prices and terms. And they also lack access to information about issues like our market prices, lack of information about production techniques, or other important information leading to limited value of agricultural products and poor market expansion. And lack of information, lack of information on the market price also makes it difficult for them to make informed decisions about their farming practices. So it makes it difficult for them to make informed decisions about their farming practices. And market opportunities also become difficult, and this leads to lower prices of their product, as you can see here. And going back to the political aspect again, policies do not have sufficient funding to support or to empower smallholder farmers to become proficient in marketing their produce. And going back to the technical aspect, let me zoom a bit here, coming back here. Here, the issue that we found as we were doing mapping here was around the cost of new farming practices and technology. It's very high for smallholder farmers to afford, and mainly because they lack access to credit, as I said, and other financial resources. And in addition, smallholder farmers have limited access to market their crops. It makes it difficult to justify the investment or they could invest in new farming practices and technology. And as we know, new farming practices and technology also requires skills and knowledge that farmers do not have access to, still limited. And policies and regulations do not provide sufficient incentive or funding for the development of new technologies as well, and that are also appropriate for smallholder farmers. And all of this has an implication on the quality of the price. So going back to the issue of policy, there is an act that I found that is quite interesting, that was also challenging, and that's where I'm gonna stop a little bit there to talk about inadequate policies again, because we're talking about issues of access to markets. There is the Marketing Act number 47 of 1996. It has really opened up the market for everybody's farmers, everybody working in the space to be able to participate, including smallholder farmers. It's quite interesting, right? So if you hear that, it's like, yeah, but policies are really enabling. But the challenge is because there is high level of competition, smallholders, farmers are struggling really. You can see from this corner here as I zoom in, they are really struggling because of lack of skills. It becomes really difficult for them to compete with commercial farmers. Yeah, something around complexity of land tenure. South Africa has complex systems of land tenure with various forms of ownership, such as communal, private, and state-owned land. And this complexity makes it difficult to identify and prioritize land redistribution, as well as determine who should benefit from land reform policies. The government has limited resources to fund land reform programs, which then limit their effectiveness. And this has resulted in slow progress in the acquisition and redistribution of land to the landless people, and also small-scale farmers. Another issue here on political issue is the limited agricultural subsidy policies targeted for effective support to smallholder farmers. This, as you see, if you zoom a little bit, yeah, it's really leading to limited ability of farmers to earn a living or a livelihood, in the sense that they can acquire input or machinery at the subsidized prices, which is true, but it hasn't been happening properly. As a result, it also becomes difficult for them to grow their incomes. So let's keep on reducing. I will conclude by talking about the social aspect or social factors. And for those who attended our previous session, I talk about it a lot. I was using that as an example. Actually, I speak about the issue of poor communication mechanism in the cooperative model. So the way the municipality has been supporting smallholder farmers in most of those places has been through creating or supporting them to create cooperative, come together, put their effort together, put land and start operating as cooperative and benefit from skills development programs and also linkages to market and stuff like that. But that model has been very challenging because of one of the issues is the poor communication mechanism. And that leads to unequal power dynamics between cooperative leaders and farmers, which in turn leads to conflict among farmers. And conflict among farmers. Yeah, so the issue of conflict among farmers, because of, as I said, lack of clarity on contractual obligations between the cooperative and the strategic partners, especially around the issue of profit sharing and market information. has made the cooperative model to be ineffective. It has also damaged the individual and collective welfare, as well as the economic interest of members in the cooperative. And this has been the cause of the conflict. If you see the loops, I'm sure when you hear, you see a lot of balancing loops and stuff like that. The other issue that is important when we talk about social aspect is the traditional land use practices. In the place where we work in Makhuduthamaga and in most rural areas in South Africa, this issue reinforced gender inequality in agriculture. And it's done that by limiting women's access to resources and decision-making power. And it's also perpetuating cultural and social norms that prioritize men control over land and productive resources. One key way in which this manifests really is through the customary laws and practices surrounding land ownership and inheritance. In communities where we worked, land is typically owned by and controlled by men, and women have limited right to access or control land. And this has significant implication for women's ability to participate in agricultural productions, generating income. So women often lack the resources and supports they need to cultivate their own land and access market, which then limits their potential to engage in productive agricultural activities. So as you can see, addressing these barriers and increasing the participation of all groups, particularly women and youth in agriculture, is critical for sustainable economic development in South Africa, but also in the place where we work. Policies and programs, we believe, and this was one of the recommendations that we were giving, is like they really have to provide access to land, access to education, financial resources, as well as address those cultural and societal norms. If they do that, it really can help to promote greater participation of women in agriculture. So that's where I will stop. Thank you so much.